I'm showing 12:30. Do you concur? Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. I want to get the meeting rolling today. The record show it's Friday, October 14th, 2022 at 12:30 p.m., the regular meeting of the Sandag Audit Committee. Before we get started, I'd like to ask our interpreter, I believe Alberto Diaz, to introduce himself and walk through how to access our interpretation services for today's meeting. Alberto?
Thank you, Chair. We'll begin with the announcement in Spanish, and then we will be back with the announcement in English. Para hacer uso del servicio de interpretación, favor de desplazarse a la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom, donde aparecen los controles. Haga clic en el icono de interpretación, globo terráqueo, y seleccione Spanish, español. Si está utilizando la aplicación móvil de Zoom, celular, tableta, presione los puntos suspensivos, 3 puntos, luego Interpretation y luego el idioma. Además, para acceder a los servicios de interpretación de manera presencial, pida auriculares en la recepción. To use the Zoom interpretation feature, please scroll to the bottom of the Zoom screen where the meeting controls are. Click on the interpretation icon, World, and select either English or Spanish. If you are joining using the Zoom mobile app, cell phone, tablet, please press the ellipsis, 3 dots, then interpretation, and then choose your language. Additionally, to access English, Spanish, simultaneous interpretation in the room, in person, check out the headset from the receptionist. Gracias, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And now if you would all like to join me in the pledge. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And we will now jump into the agenda. And before we start with the first item, I did want to just note.
Excuse me, Chair.
Oh, sure.
I would like to do a roll call vote.
Oh, yeah.
I mean
a roll call. Okay.
And confirm that we have a quorum.
Sure.
For the roll call, Chair Zito.
Present.
Agnes Wong Nickerson. Here. Stuart Halpern.
Present.
And Robert Monson. Here. And Vice Chair Vasquez is absent. And that confirms a quorum.
Okay, thank you. And I will note that we have a very full and robust agenda today, and I want to make sure we have good discussion, but I do have a hard stop at 2:30, so I apologize in advance if I try to move people along, because I will have to get up and leave at 2:30. With that, we'll move into the agenda, and the first item on the agenda is the minutes. And does any member of the public have comments on the minutes, Francesca?
There are no public comments.
Okay, do any board members have comments? Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
A motion.
Motion by Monson.
I'll second.
Second by Halpern. Please vote. Are we using our voting pucks, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay, so you have to use these. Press 1 for yes, 2 for no. And that motion passes unanimously with members present. And that moves us on to item number 2, public comments. Francesca, do we have any non-agenda public comments?
There are no public comments on this item.
Great. And do we have any board member non-agenda public comments? Seeing none, we will move on to the agency report, and we are lucky to have Hassan here to give us the agency report today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon to all of you. This has been an exciting 3 weeks at Sandag. Last week we had a community event. More than 1,000 San Diegans participated, where we presented 3 different ideas out of a process we call Request for Information Concepts. You're going to hear about them, but one of them is about a smart mobility, reconfiguring the highway system so it can fit more as capacity. The second was extending the trolley 1 mile into Tijuana, pretty much building CBX 2. And the third is about smart shuttles or flexible fleets. We're really glad to hear from the community. Our chair and second vice chair were there to share with the community. And for those of you who attended, thank you. I want to say publicly, I'm really grateful for President Pro Tem Atkins, because we received that big check, $300 million, 2 days ago in Del Mar, where Congressman Levin, President Pro Tem Atkins, and many of our elected leaders, and I'm sorry our chair wasn't there, we'll do better next time. But this is really truly an amazing thing, because as I reported to the board, now the passenger service between Oceanside and Irvine is not there. It stopped because the slope in Orange County and San Clemente is encroaching, and now Orange County is in the process of stabilizing the slope like we did. But we were ahead of the game. We did the studies with the envy of the rest of the state. I'm grateful for the leaders who made that happen. And finally, yesterday, together with the governor's infrastructure appointee, Mayor Villaraigosa, Secretary of Transportation, Tox Amashikan, and the Secretary of Information, Madam Tang, I believe her last name, opened the first 500 feet of a 10,000 statewide, but 18 miles in San Diego. San Diego was the first in the state to do this broadband on the 67. So these are amazing celebration. And this morning, and I'll be short here, and I want to thank Member Agnes Wang Nickerson for being at the joint board meeting. This morning we made history, and that history is the board approved the resolution to move forward with a binding agreement with Mexico to deliver finally Otay Mesa 2. I'm gonna, with others, be in Mexico City on the 25th to sign that agreement on behalf of the region. This is an amazing project, multi-billion-dollar project, took a lot of work for many, many years, starting with my predecessor, Gary Gallegos, and on. But today is also significant because it's one of the very few times in my tenure here that we get an unanimous board action. So, Chair, that concludes my report. Be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. Francesca, do we have any public member comments on the chair, on the executive director's report?
There are no public comments on this item.
Great. Do we have any board member comments or questions? And it was good seeing you at the meeting again also this morning, Ms. Wong Nickerson, for that momentous occasion. It was quite exciting, if a little lengthy. Anyway, we will now move on to the IPA update, and Mary.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. I just wanted to thank everyone at Sandag for inviting OPA to that community event. They actually had a nice booth set up for us with all of our picture taken of the group in our professional attire. And we had two of our newer staff who actually came from Sandag participate and volunteer to be on that booth. So it was really cool that we were able to be involved in that and participate. The only other item that I have to update is the status of part 2 of the part 1 that we are going to be going over, the contracts audit. That audit is rigorous as a result of really the part 1 areas that we identified as findings. And so it's going to take us a lot longer than we anticipated to go through documents and amendments. There are many of them, and just the organization, again, due to the system. So it probably will not be January that we bring this item to you. It will probably be more like February or March. So we will keep you updated, but at this point we do see a delay. I have nothing else.
Thank you for the update. Francesca, no, do we have, Tessa, keep on saying Francesca. Tessa, do we have any updates or comments from the public?
There are no public comments.
Thanks, Tessa. And how about any board member comments or questions? Seeing none, we will now move on to the report section. And the first item is the purchase cost audit final progress report. And this looks like it's Andre and Mary, and I see Andre in the back. Are you going to start?
Yes, I am, Chair. Thank
Great.
you.
Welcome.
Thank you. So I think before I before I begin my presentation today, I thought it may be helpful to summarize what actions have occurred regarding the P-card audit to date. So at your June 10th meeting, staff presented the audit committee, the revised purchase card policy in response to the findings and recommendations by OIPA. In addition to revising the P-card policy and to demonstrate a strong commitment to transparency and improving business operations, management also presented 2 policies pertaining to meals and food. First, the business meals policy, which set parameters for meals hosted by senior executives for legitimate business purposes. Secondly, the hospitality and events policy, which set parameters for providing food and beverages for SANDAG meetings and events. At that meeting, the audit committee reviewed and recommended that the board of directors authorize the CEO to implement the new administrative policies developed in response to the P-card audit. Management had also committed to undertake 16 actions in response to the P-card audit, and at that June 10th meeting, staff presented a number of completed actions that were mostly related to new policies that have since been adopted. Today, I'm pleased to say that we have completed the remaining actions of the P-card action plan, and those items were related to reviewing past transactions and the training on the new policy. Specifically for actions 1.1 and 1.3 were for training of all employees with P-card responsibilities, including the cardholders, department managers, approving officials, and accounting and finance staff was developed and implemented. The training program was to increase awareness and understanding of the responsibilities, expectations, and procedures associated with appropriate use of the SANDAG issued credit cards. This training was mandatory, and we actually had to have 4 different sessions to ensure that all staff were covered. Training shall reoccur on an annual basis and as needed. For actions 3.2 and 3.7, those were to review past P-card transactions to identify any improper use, including the purchase of gift cards. We started with the SANDAG Quality Assurance Quality Control, or the QA/QC team. That team reviewed all available credit card transactions for the period July 1st, 2017 to June 30th, 2021, which meant looking through a total of 658 statements, which is actually 7,752 invoices and backup, along with the reconciliation packets. Administrative deficiencies consistent with the audit findings were identified. As your CFO, who is responsible for the general oversight of the P-card policy, I reviewed all transactions flagged by the QA/QC team and took steps to obtain supporting documentation or transaction log approvals if these were noted as missing. We were able to find a number of approvals supporting documentation that was simply misfiled. However, no instances of improper use of the SANDAG credit cards could be confirmed based on the secondary review of available records. Therefore, no corrective action was deemed. Our focus now will be going forward. I'm appreciative with the collaboration of Mary Kay's team, and I'm confident that we have the right policies and procedures in place. And I'm confident that if Mary Kay and the team come back to audit us, we'll be in a much better place than we were prior to the audits. Thank you, Chair. That concludes my report. I'm available for any questions.
Thanks, Andre. So Part B is OPA finalizing and looking over the 4 tasks. Action 1.1 and 1.3, we did review the purchase card training PowerPoint, the acknowledgement forms, as well as the tracking document, and all of them were very strong, covered sufficiently. The training covered well the policies. We had already looked at the policies. Of course, they were detailed, very good policies. If they're followed, we should not have any issues in the future when we do audits or perform audits. So quite impressed again. I think they completed these tasks quickly and really well, sufficiently, really great policies. The last 3.2 and 3.7, I really can attest or express an opinion on. I wasn't part of that team. And if we were to express or attest to anything on that portion, it would really take OPA going in re-auditing. And we just don't have the time or resources to do that. So we're relying on the proficiency of that group, that they did their diligence, and I'm sure they did. And just to know that we are going to be auditing on a continuous basis in the future to assure that they're adhering to their policies and procedures, and that there's good support and receipts and such. So we're confident that there won't be future problems. That's all.
Great, thank you, Mary. Tessa, do we have any public member questions or comments about item 5?
There are no public comments on 5A or 5B.
Okay, great, thank you. Are there any board member comments on this particular item that people would like to make? Seeing none. Andre, thank you for the presentation. I appreciate the diligence that you've put into this, and that management has put into this, as well as the effort that Mary's team has to make sure that we have robust processes going forward. And you know, the one thing that is interesting to me about this is that, you know, there's been a lot of for lack of a better term, public stink that's been made about the results of this audit. And I think we just all are behooved to be aware and understand that, you know, when you have an agency that hasn't been through an audit process before of the depth and incredible skill and diligence that Mary's team puts to it, you're going to find stuff. And we found stuff, and we've taken actions to correct it. And I'm impressed how quickly this one's gone. I mean, I personally had thought the salaries and compensation one was too long, but again, we were just learning our muscles, and this one was an example of one well run and well done, and I'm very happy to see that that this is providing for an opportunity for the agency to grow and do better, and looking forward to what will happen with the continuous auditing process going forward, validating that. So thank you again. Let's see with this one. This is just information, so we will now move to item 6, which is the Independent Performance Auditor Contracts and Procurement Operational System Control Audit Report Part 1. And Mary, you can introduce this one for us. Thanks.
Thank you. So this has been a very challenging audit, to say the least, but we were able to finally get part 1. As everyone is aware, we decided to make this a 2-part audit. Again, sort of looking internally at the processes, policies, controls, procedures, training from an internal perspective. And then part 2, we decided was best for the readers and the public for better understanding to move that to a part 1, or part 2. Part 2 is really looking externally at the impact of what we found in part 1, and really looking at the contractors and their obligation and expectations in regards to the contracts. So with that, I already shared that we are going to be extending that out because it's quite a task. But moving into part 1 discussion, next slide, please. I wanted to, and this kind of resulted from a discussion I was having with Chair Zito, and he's right that I probably needed to bring some explanation. We often, as auditors, call audits, which are full audits, and they're under GAGAS, reviews. So he did catch me in, like, you're saying a review in part of your audit, but then you refer to it as an audit. What is it? And so that was a really good point. And so we did go in and kind of be more consistent. But as I said, as auditors typically call a performance audit a review, because though a performance audit is a full-blown audit and it is following GAGAS, it is more looking at not so much the financial statements as a whole, which is what number 1 is under GAGAS, which is a financial audit, and that gets done once a year here by our external auditors. But a performance audit is more looking at the nuts and bolts of an organization for effectiveness and efficiencies, around controls, around compliance, and then testing the results of that. So we do tests like invoices and everything, really the results of those controls, those procedures, those policies. So it is a full-blown audit, but often a performance audit is often referred to as a review. So I did want to clarify that. There is a financial audit, performance audit. They're both under GAGAS. They both are full audits. So what we have prepared here is, and we felt it was the best to do that, is to really look, like I said, at the foundation of the organization, because it hadn't been looked at for many years, and really do a performance review, which involves a piece of the financial part of it, but more focused around the nuts and bolts of the organization. So with that, I will move it forward. Lloyd is going to present the objective and the purpose of the audit, and then we'll move it along to Mike and Crystal. Lloyd?
Thanks, Mary. The scope of this, as the scope and objective.
I'm sorry, I've asked them to say next slide, so you're just going to have to remember to tell them.
Oh,
next
okay, I'm
slide.
sorry. So the scope and objective of this audit, of this review, is the contracts and procurement, and it's for the audit period of July 1st, 2017 to June 30th, 2021. However, we looked at all open contracts within that period, and even if it initiated prior to the audit period or still ongoing after the audit period, we're looking at those contracts to ensure that we get the full picture of the audit. As Mary stated, it's broken into two parts. The first part of the review is SANDAG's system of controls and operation to ensure effective and efficient controls are being followed. In addition, we reviewed SANDAG's procedures and policies to ensure they're consistent with federal, state, and other applicable governing laws and regulations. Part two, that's part one. Part two of the contract is looking at the supporting documents and contractors. We are currently in the process of performing testing, and we hope to complete it by, I thought it would be January, but it's going to take longer just because on the second part, we've identified approximately over 10,000 invoices to look at. And so therefore, it may take a little longer. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Crystal and Mike, who will go over the findings.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Lloyd. Can I get to the next slide, please? Thank you. So these, the presentation will go, we will explain the observation, what we saw, the potential risks those observations have, and then our recommendations from there. Our first finding that we found was those are inadequate administrative standard operating procedures, SOPs, for contract analysts and project managers. We found that contract analysts and project managers do not have SOPs. The following were cited as procedures: the procurement manual, various contract templates, forms on the shared SANDAG website and SharePoint, or policies and project plans. The best way I could describe it is a lot of these things, particularly the procurement manual, describe what needs to be done, but not necessarily how to do it. And the risk that this poses is that staff duties are not clear or properly segregated and overlap in assignment of duties and responsibilities. Contract analysts completing project manager tasks. Tasks are overlooked, missed, or inconsistently completed. Project delays, and difficulty and inconsistency in training new staff. Next slide, please. So the OIPA is recommending that staff create formalized standard operating procedures with clear step-by-step instructions for assigned tasks for each contract analyst and project managers, provide formal and regular training to contract analysts and project managers on assigned roles, responsibilities, and procedures, and to update the procurement manual to clearly identify and segregate roles and responsibilities for those analysts and project managers. Next slide, please. Finding 2 was insufficient training of contract analysts and project managers and insufficient requirements to qualify as a project manager. We found that most contract analyst training is internal, minimal, informal, and inconsistent, and that only some project managers had formal training. These inconsistencies identified include only 4 of the 13 analysts that we reach out to did not have formal training or certifications, and only some received training from outside sources. Analysts were not being encouraged to join professional associations or seek external training. Cases of interns training other interns. Analysts providing training in addition to their daily workload. And as stated before, analysts completing project manager tasks. and analysts must sometimes remind project managers of conflict of interest restrictions. And we found that there are 192 active project managers in the contract management system, or abbreviated CMS from here out, and 238 employees with the ability to be assigned as a project manager. So 192 active project managers, but there are 238 employees who could be a project manager. Next slide, please. So the risk resulting from that is the inconsistencies in following policies and procedures, missing steps in the procurement process, loss of federal funding due to non-compliance of laws, rules, and regulations, delays in processing procurement requests, improper segregation of duties, contract analysts completing project manager tasks, vendors taking advantage of staff's lack of knowledge of procedures, processes and procedures, assigning unqualified staff as project managers, and excessive assignment of project managers. You might notice that there was a bit of repeating us from finding one. These findings can and do overlap with each other. Next slide, please. So we are recommending that staff create SOPs for contract analysts and project manager specific tasks, more clearly segregate the duties of contract analysts and project managers, provide consistent training for analysts by internal subject matter experts and or management, provide annual and or continuous training on the procurement manual and standard operating procedures for both analysts and project managers, identify and require specific qualifications to be met and specialized training to be completed by an employee prior to the assignment of a project manager role, and to encourage external professional association training specific to procurement, such as CAPO and IGP, and project management. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our third finding was that there was an itemized breakdown of work performed not required for invoice payment. We observed that itemized breakdown for work performed is not required for an invoice to be processed. Required documentation by vendors for payment is inconsistent. Only some project managers require detailed support for work performed, and detailed summaries were only provided when explicitly requested. The risks this poses are paying for incomplete or subpar work, paying for unauthorized services, overpayment or duplicate payments, and federal funding loss, potential federal funding loss. I should be clear on that. Next slide, please. And we are recommending that staff require detailed and itemized invoices and progress reports or detailed summary of work performed for payment to be processed. Update the request for payment form to explicitly require itemized invoices to be attached. Create formal SOPs and training for invoice payments to include instructions and methods for verifying invoice work is included in the contractor task order. And update contract templates to require the detailed / itemized invoices, as well as progress reports or detailed summaries of work performed to be included with invoices. I'm going to hand it over to Crystal for the next few findings. And Crystal.
Hi, everyone. So next slide, please. So for finding 4, we identified inadequate contract management system with limited capabilities and usage, and inaccurate and missing information. The current CMS, the contract management system, is not fully being used as a document management system, nor document sorting and filing system. That was identified in the CMS guide, that's what it would be used for. The CMS's limited capabilities include not recording, tracking, or reporting total not to exceed amounts per contract or vendor. Those amounts must be manually calculated. Not tracking up-to-date encumbrance amounts or amounts paid against a contract or task order. Not tracking a list or number of subcontractors on a contract or task order. Allowing users to edit and replace contracts or documents after contract execution. Allowing requests when funds are unavailable. So procurement requests can be submitted when funds have been expended. Allowing auto-populated fields be left blank. Only one contract employee is currently trained to run advanced reports in the CMS system. Additionally, what we found was a list was provided from the contracts department, and in that list, we identified that records were inaccurate or incomplete as follows. So there were multiple versions of staff member names, so sometimes duplicates, sometimes Mike versus Michael. Project manager was labeled as a generic username, so something like user 3000. 80 records where project manager field is left blank. 1,052 records where the department field is left blank. 1,056 records where the division field is left blank. Those, again, blank fields, we don't know which department or project manager or division they belong to, just at glancing at the CMS system. The employee may be listed as the project manager while not actually acting as a project manager. Next slide, please. So the risks resulting from these internal control weaknesses are errors and inconsistencies with the reported total amounts per contract and per vendor. Again, these have to be manually calculated. A task order can be executed under a fully expended contract. The limited ability to efficiently conduct any quality control or accurate auditing. Changes basically can be made to the records, and discovery of that has to be done via review of the history. So thorough review of that. Unreliability of the CMS records and reports due to the allowed changes at any time. Unreliability of amounts recorded in or reported from CMS due to inaccurate or outdated data. This information is not always shared with the Finance One Solution system, so it may not always match. Subconsultants are not formally authorized on a contract or task order, may actually work on a project if the PM or the contract analyst cannot easily verify whether they're active subconsultants on a contract. Delay in report running, delay in locating required documents, inability to identify who a project manager is, unclarity on who to contact with questions regarding the request or documents submitted, inability to easily identify bid rigging schemes, collusion amongst contractors, collusion between contractors and employees by bid tailoring, bid manipulation, bid splitting, and leaking of bid data, and then the potential for federal funding losses. Next slide. The recommendations that we have for staff are to replace the current CMS. The replacement CMS should be able to communicate and integrate with our finance encumbrances, invoice and payment records to include tracking, searching, recording, invoice payments against contracts, task orders, et cetera, and that data is stored within, should be user-friendly, easily accessible, and easily reportable. Again, at this time, that's not the case. Provide staff training and standard operating procedures on using the replacement CMS and submitting all types of requests. Ensure that staff can efficiently, easily query list of contractors and subcontractors within the replacement CMS. Ensure that all contracts and related, what do we have? Sorry, I'm one slide behind. Are easily stored in one easily accessible location. Ensure that the replacement CMS is updated with correct and complete information and data to correct the inaccuracies and blanks from the records. Require that the listed project manager in the replacement CMS system be the actual project manager. Specify required fields in the replacement CMS and require that all mandatory fields be completed. Provide CMS access, but based on staffed job duties. Ensure that replacement CMS provides efficient audit trail. Ensure that more than one employee, but preferably 3 or more, has in-depth knowledge, training, and skills in the replacement CMS and can provide reports to the auditors. Additionally, what's missing? So for next slide, please. Oh, there it is. Sorry. One last item. If the recommendation 1 is not chosen, which is the replacement of the CMS system, then we just ask that the remainder items be implemented for the current CMS. Next slide, please. So the finding 5 is the modification of details in records of negotiation. So I'll start by saying that this is not a widespread practice. This was just one item identified as such. We looked at other records and did not find that this is an ongoing or regular thing. So a project manager provided leading information to a vendor when requesting a cost proposal. contract staff then deleted the communication in the record of negotiation and summarized it as a request for a cost proposal. This procurement request should just not have been authorized. So just to elaborate on that, we request a cost proposal. The project manager does. In that process, they provide a scope of work. In this event, we provided ICE information, so independent cost information that included hours estimated internally and the costs for that. So essentially our budget and calculation, and presented that with our request for a cost proposal. And so that's why that shouldn't have been processed. The risks resulting from internal control weaknesses in this case are that this eliminates any of Sandag's negotiating power to receive the best possible price. It violates the integrity and transparency of the procurement process, and there is a potential risk of employee and contractor collusion. Next slide, please. Our recommendation to staff is to create a formal standard operating procedure and provide training on completing a record of negotiation to both project managers and contract analysts, provide negotiation training and/or guidelines to project managers and contract analysts to include reasons or intent of negotiations, best practices, and risk of not negotiating and/or following these best practices. Next slide. So our sixth finding is inadequate documentation for sole source transactions. What we observed was from a sample of 38 sole source transactions reviewed, we identified that 2 transactions were missing justification forms. The requests require justification forms. Inconsistent labeling and filing of justification forms. Justification forms were found in 4 different filing locations. 13 forms with amounts that did not match the record amount, so the procurement request amount. 5 justification forms missing at least 1 approval signature. CMS did not accurately record all sole sources. And then the method of procurement selection form, which is also required, is not always submitted with a sole source transaction. The risk resulting from these internal control weaknesses are non-compliance with funding regulations, disqualification from future funding opportunities, and the disorganization of record keeping around this can cause difficulty in locating files, such as the justification forms, delays in processing sole source requests and other contract documents, limits Sandag's ability to easily confirm processes were actually followed. Next slide, please. And the recommendations around this finding are to provide training to staff on sole source laws, rules, regulations, and processes, create formal administrative procedures on sole source processes, update the current sole source justification template to include procurement request details such as the contract, task order, amendment number, project manager name, vendor name, etc., and to reorganize contract and sole source records in one centralized location, update CMS to have accurate information, and then ensure required documents are saved as separate files and labeled accordingly, such as saving a sole source justification form as such. Next slide, please. So this is the 7th and final finding. What we identified is material weaknesses with the identification of on-call and sole source contracts and amendments. Auditors identified material weaknesses within the ability to identify when an increase is due to competed task orders, sole sources, amendments, etc. We are going to be talking about 2 reports here. So for the purposes of this slide, CMS Report 1, which was received in July of 2022, we identified that there were no clear identification of amendments tied to on-call contracts, nor accurate identification of sole source procurements. Records mislabeled under incorrect base contracts, record titles not specifying which contract task order they are related to, 1,627 total contracts, which included 308 on-call contracts, 447 contracts with blank original amounts, including 271 on-call contracts. Approximately 88% of all on-call contracts have blank original amounts. And I'll pass it back to Mike so he can talk about our data analysis and methodology around these.
Thank you, Crystal. Next slide, please. So we conducted an analysis on these two CMS reports. Each analysis we did, we looked at the highest percentage increase from original to current amount and highest dollar amount increase from original to current amount. I'll explain what those are in more detail. So the first CMS report, which Crystal just mentioned, included all open and active contracts during the audit period, specifically from July 1st, 17 through July 1st, 2022, including contracts initiated prior to the audit period and or contracts that remain open and active beyond the audit period, like Lloyd mentioned early on. For the percentage change increases, in order to avoid small amounts, like really like showing up, we don't like want to point out $1,000 increase to $5,000 and like have that like show up on the table. That's not really crucial. We only have if the sum of the original amounts of all the vendors, of all the contracts for a vendor in this audit period was larger than $1 million. So we can at least look at large enough dollar figures. For this first analysis, we excluded contracts with blank original amounts and on-call contracts. We excluded task orders and amendments and other offsets to avoid what's called double counting. The best way I can describe it is this. If we had a contract for $100,000 and then there was an amendment for $10,000, so that contract would now have a current amount of $110,000. If we didn't take out that amendment in the system, it would show base contract 100,000, amendment is 10,000, but then, like I said, the current amount of the base contract is now 110,000. So it's like you're double counting that amendment. So in order to conduct that analysis, we would take that stuff out. And current amount represents the current maximum amount that could be paid and not the actual amounts that have been paid out already. So the total percentage increase for all contracts, excluding in this analysis, excluding contracts with blank original amounts and on-call contracts, is 5%. Next slide, please. So the first thing that might jump out to you is that the vendors are anonymized. The reason we're doing that is because we don't want to name these vendors right now because it might be issues on our end and not the contractor. We don't want to place blame on a contractor if we're not sure yet. This is part one of an ongoing audit, and we don't want to compromise any potential investigations with that as of now. Once part two is done, if a PRA wants to be requested, we would be glad to help in on anonymize those vendors for that PRA request. Anyways, the top vendors saw, this is largest percentage increase, saw an increase of 459%, 293%, and 108% from the original agreed amount to what the current amount awarded. Next slide, please. This one is a table of the largest dollar amount increase. So you might see how the vendors are repeated. It just represents the same vendor. So the same vendor A from table 1.1 is the same vendor here at the top here. So the largest increases here were 20.8 million, 10.4 million, and then 8.3 million. Next slide, please. So the second analysis we did was only of on-call contracts. So it was a similar analysis. We received the CMS Report 2, that's what we'll refer to it as, on September 21st, 2022. It once again included all open and active on-call contracts during the audit period and including contracts that were initiated prior and are still active. Once again, for the percentage increase, not to get skewed by small numbers, we only included original amounts with the sum of all the original amounts of the contract for a vendor was larger than $1 million. Once again, we excluded contracts with blank original amounts. And the total percentage increase, like the average increase for all on-call contracts was 46%. Next slide, please.
Mike, real quick, could you explain the definition of an on-call contract? Because not everybody would know that.
Yeah, I'm going to cede that, Crystal, I'm going to cede that to you because you are more of a contract expert with the actual definition of an on-call contract. I want to, let you take that.
So an on-call contract basically, let me think of a clear way to explain this. So a basic contract, a standard contract, not on call, is going to be a contract where we've defined the services. So we've clearly defined exactly what this contractor is going to be doing, and that's outlined in the scope of work. We have a fee schedule clearly outlined. An on-call contract is slightly different. So we will explain the types of services that this contractor will be hired for, and we would issue task orders against that contract. So we might authorize an on-call contract for, say, $1 million, That doesn't mean they're getting $1 million. It's just the maximum that they would be allowed to use, basically based on the task orders authorized. So there will be task orders authorized under that with clear, specific scopes of work that fall in line with the general scope of work. And again, that might be tied to a specific project that we need. An example might be legal services, and we will authorize that we need them to work on this legal project or advise here or advise there. And so task orders would be issued for those individual things. And that gets deducted from the total authorized for the contract. But again, each task order has a specified amount for the specific work that now has been identified.
Do all on-call contracts, are they all open competitively bid, or are they bench, or could you explain that part? Is there a competitive open bid on each on-call, or is it like a bench?
So Sandag specifically does have a bench. And so when they compete for a bench, those projects, those, I guess, contractors get a bench contract, let's call it. And the resulting task orders under that generally are expected to be competed, yes.
So Crystal, so to Mary's point, so for us to be able to go to on-call, they have to have gone through the competitive process and made the list. So there is a competitive process to get on the list for on-call.
Yes, so there's a competitive process to get on the bench,
Right.
and then there is a competitive process generally to then be
exactly.
awarded a task order. So it's a two-step process.
Right.
But
more
the
or less.
competitive bidding, once they're on the bench, they're really competitively bid with each other on the bench?
Yes.
It's not an open
It's not an
competition
open-
every time? Okay.
That's correct. So then, let's say we have 10 vendors on this bench that were awarded from this original on-call request. At that point, then, if we've identified a task order that needs to be completed, we would only send it to those 10 contractors. We would not publicly advertise this and have an open competition. It would be only open to those already pre-awarded.
Yeah.
So normally, yes, there is so again, you have to keep in mind that there is a generic scope of work. It's very broad. And so there's a variety of things that they could have included in this bench on-call contract. And so depending on what was decided, we would have requested maybe hourly rates or fixed fee. Usually, I think, again, for that initial competitive process, it might just be hourly rates is what we're looking at, again, because there isn't really a project outlined yet at that point. And so that later happens at the task order level where we say specifically, you're going to be doing X, Y, Z. Now, there is an opportunity at that point for them to provide an updated rates. Generally, I think the process is to keep it in line. It should align with the contract. But again, that's really going to depend on a few things. One, what the contract says. If the contract allows them to resubmit rates or that we would negotiate the task order at the task order level, then that really just allows for them to submit new rates altogether. Otherwise, if it's, the expectation is that it has to fall in line with that. And even if they provide, say, a fixed fee amount, it should still align with the hourly rates that they've already quoted us. There's a few things that can happen. It really depends on what we put in the contract and if we specified or didn't.
Okay, thank you. Just as a reminder to members, make sure you turn your mic on so the people online can hear us. I don't know if that question was heard by the public. And then in general, we'll try to save our questions at the end, but if you need to jump in for immediate clarification, let me know. Thanks.
All right, so thank you for the explanation of on-call contracts. So this first table of table 2.1, the largest increase from original amount or the original amount to current amount for on-call contracts only was one vendor with a 698% increase, then 127%, and then two tied at 99%. Next slide, please. For the total dollar amounts, the largest increase was about just under 64 million, 31.5 million, and then also 27.5 million. Next slide. So the final analysis we conducted is kind of what these first two led into this third one. It's the combination of both on-call and non-on-call contracts. Same stipulations apply, only vendors where the total contract original amounts larger than $1 million were considered, and we excluded the blank original amounts. The total percentage increase for all contracts combined to get a baseline is 19%. Next slide, please. So once it's all combined, the largest percentage increases were 698% again, 459%, and 293%. Next slide, please. For largest dollar amounts, once again, it's just under 64 million, 31.5 million, and 29.8 million.
If I may, Chair, ask a question. So can you talk, and I don't know whether you can, when you say services, say for the first one, vendor Z,
Yeah.
what kind of service? Can you give us an example?
We kind of divided into two, whether it's construction, services. I believe one, we had a public agency. It's just if you were to go look at what that vendor does or what they provide, it would just be services. Like,
Shelley, we wanted to make sure that we identified whether it was a service or a construction. Because construction would make sense that you might see a larger amendment because a lot of stuff comes up in construction. So services would be anything that is non-construction.
So give me an example. I mean, this is a large amount.
Attorney consulting
Oh, okay.
or HR consulting
Okay, got
or
it.
any kind of consultant.
Okay, gotcha.
all right, next slide, please. So you might have noticed that between like tables 2.1, 2.2, and 3.1, 3.2 were kind of very similar. That's kind of the point we're trying to show here. The significance of this result is that 5 contractors appear in the top 10 largest percentage increase for both the on-call and total combined tables. And there's 8 contractors for the 10 largest dollar increase for both the on-call and total combined tables. So 5 vendors appear in table 2.1 and 3.1, and 8 contractors appear in table 2.2 and 3.2. So it appears to be that there's a disproportionate preference to certain vendors based on the totality of the contract amounts, and results of this finding exhibit how much the contractor has the ability to be reimbursed. Part 2 of this audit will allow auditors to determine if on-call contracts have been amended, sole source, and if all requirements were followed. Next slide, please. The risk of all this is that the potential risk for all this is that there could be favoritism and repeated awards to the same vendor, authorizing unjustified sole source and overuse of sole sources, overpaying for contractor work and costs exceeding estimated budgets, disadvantaged business enterprise goals, DBE goals not being met, limited or lack of full and open competition, lack of public trust, and not being able to easily identify big rigging schemes, collusion amongst contractors, collusion between contractors and employees, bid manipulation, bid splitting, and leaking of bid data. Next slide, please. The OIPA is recommending that staff review the on-call process to ensure fairness and equity throughout, provide procurement planning training with the steps and timeline needed to prepare projects, ensure sufficient planning efforts are made to avoid sole sources and amendments, review the sole source policies to ensure a clear understanding of allowed requests, limitations, and approval requirements, create sole source standard operating procedures for all levels of the approval process, provide sole source training with examples of justified/allowable requests and unjustified examples due to poor planning, ensure on-call procurements are being sufficiently advertised to reach a variety of qualified contractors, including public platform outreach and attendance of outreach events to attract new and disadvantaged contractors and subcontractors, and to revise the procurement manual to avoid conflicting language, particularly with architectural and engineering contract management and sole sources. Next slide, please. We'll take your questions now. Thank you.
Yeah, did we want to go to questions, or was there a management response as part of this first? Yeah, why don't we go to the management response and then we'll get into questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Zito, and thank you, Mike, Crystal, Lloyd, all of you for being here. Thank you, Mary. I want to thank Mary Kay with her team doing an amazing work to guess for an important, as I said many times, I always, and I think while we're independent, we agree on one thing, that policies and controls for an agency like ours is a must. And I'm committed to that, and no different here. We are committed to that. This audit actually validates some of the concerns I have, my team have, in the fact that changes are needed. We have accepted the various findings and committed to taking action. Could we have stronger policies and procedure? Of course. Could we have more trained project manager? Absolutely. Would better system work? Absolutely. So there's no surprises there. When I meant to say in the beginning that I am not Ray Major, because that's who was supposed to present to you. And our thoughts and prayers go to Ray and his family. He lost his father this morning. But Ray, as a deputy CEO for operation, work closely with Mary, is committed, and I trust him. I believe in him, and I believe in the independent performance, independent auditor to get there. I am no stranger in taking actions and sometimes upsetting people. During my short, little over 3 years at Sandag, I have gone through major restructuring, especially at the executive level. And that including dismissing executives and bringing in new ones, and contract is part of that. In my opinion, it's important to have the right structure to move this agency forward. And I, trust in what's being done here, but I hope is the goal that Mary and I has, that is to provide the right policies and controls, are not overshadowed by the desire to make public speeches and go and trash the agency. I mean, our manager Trespasses included. I think I'll let Mary and her team speak. We're not saying no to any policy and control suggestion. We have initiated improvement in some areas, but we need a lot more. We are trying to we created a project management office because one of the findings is too many project managers with lack of experience, and that is very true, and we're going to work on that. We're making investment in the systems. Actually, many of the systems we use are internally created. They're obsolete. They totally shouldn't be the system we use for such a large operation. And actually, some don't have a system, but have a paper trail. And when you do paper trail, sometimes you make mistake. But we have a new leader. Kelly is written right here in contracts, and we have 22 employees. And my message to them is, as I treat the independent performance auditor, I treat them. Nobody has the right to go and tell them anything that they are not professionally going to do. And Crystal came from that department. Now she's on the other side. I'm glad, Crystal, you know the side.
You can't have her back.
Yeah, that's right. No. And I'm glad she's where she is, because we want to make sure we do the right thing. So we are committed as staff to put not only the people in place and the structure, but the systems. And right now we're developing what we call enterprise resource planning tool. Everything has abbreviation in our world, ARP, right? ERP. This new tool will help a great deal, and a lot of the things that a lot of the recommendation is going to make them solve. But just to give you a perspective of what we're talking about, and that's why I think Lloyd mentioned it's going to take them longer for part 2. We have more than 1,100 active agreements with nearly 300 unique vendors. 1,100. Last year, we processed 800 transactions and issues more than $300 million worth of work. So this is a big operation, and I'm actually shocked that they finished by this time. I didn't think they would when I knew the amount, but they did, and it's going to take them longer to do the other one. So the operation requires this kind of work. One of the things that's missing from our management Trespasses is an action plan, and intentionally we don't want to do an action plan for this part before the second part. And once the two parts are done, we'll work with Mary and her team to make sure, like we did in the PCAR audit, in the compensation audit, that this action plan is sound. And we'll do it together in partnership. There are seven findings like I just presented to you. Management has accepted those findings. And you can read through the findings that fit into four categories: inadequate policies and procedure, standardized procedure, insufficient training for staff, inadequate system, poor practice with respect to on-call. I do want to emphasize this, and I hope I saw the report right, that with respect to finding 7, it's important to emphasize that the auditors did not find any fraud or any intentional wrongdoing as part of their audit. That doesn't mean they're right. That doesn't mean they're not required. But I think Mary would be the first one to tell me if there is such a thing. There is intentional wrongdoing. That's important. Because that's a no-no, period, in the discussion for anybody, regardless of their position. And that goes for both elected leadership and staff. To just emphasize our commitment as management to working with the independent performance auditor in all the areas that need strengthening controls and policies, and do it as soon as possible. But as I told you, the scope of this is really large. This is last year was $1.3 billion, the year before $1.4 billion agency. I mean, the years of the audit averages at $1.3 billion operation a year, with sometimes 10 different funding sources for one project. And I would say, if one thing as manager, not auditor, I complained about that contracts take too long here. When contractors, I try to attract other contractors from other areas. They say, no, we don't want to, your contract takes too long, 6 to 9 months. And the other thing is, well, the procedure you go through for the amount of money. So sometimes, even though some of the audit findings to be found, whether these on-call, there is not many companies that willing to come into San Diego and work in San Diego. But even with that, we need to make sure that there's competitive process, there's no favoritism, that managers are trained, that the public is served. All of that, I really do appreciate that the findings you have found. I look forward to the action plan that we hopefully, like we did before, are going to put together to make sure that this agency is in its way to be a world-class organization. And I'm committed to that. As long as I'm the CEO of this agency, and Mary knows this, and I really respect what she's trying to do. If this is about controls and policies, I'm all in. But I also want you to know that, with all due respect to this gentleman to my right, this board is interesting. This board does not allow you to do what's right. This board loves to come here and take material for their speeches and go and trash the agency. The very agency they sit in their board. And as from day one until now, I will say no to that. And the result of that is indifferent to me. I don't go to bed worrying about whether they're gonna fire me or demote me. That's absolutely indifferent. This agency, with the help of Mary and her team, is gonna be a world-class agency when we're done. But the politics is too nasty and not sometimes allow us to have an open dialogue. And I don't know how Mary feels, but I feel that the dysfunctionality of this board is not helping a lot. But nevertheless, I personally will commit that I will work with my team to make sure that we have the right controls and policies. So everyone that works with Sandag or knows about Sandag knows that we're a good agency. So that concludes my management response.
Thank you, Hassan. I would like to, did you want to wrap up,
Yeah,
Mary?
I just
Okay.
want to wrap up and add, I have been working closely with Hassan and Ray. I will say Ray has been 100% supportive since he's taken the assistant CEO as operations. So he is 100% behind, Ray comes from private, so he's 100% behind making sure things are done right, efficient, effective, there's good control. So he's very supportive of this. He did come to me and let me know that, we can't give you a corrective action plan. And I said, I wouldn't have expected one. If you would have given me one, I would have been concerned. There's a lot to fix here. And the biggest issue is there's a system to fix here. And it would be really inefficient for them to try to build policies and procedures around what we're recommending when they have a system that they're thinking about possibly replacing. So I do recommend that moving forward, I did express the importance of us being involved in the implementation of the new system. It's very important. There's some hard stops and system controls, not manual controls, that need to make sure that the new system has built in. And there are very obvious controls like hard stops. You can't move from one cell to the next cell unless you put something in that cell. Consistent naming processes, all of those things we've recommended, it needs to be in any system. And we just hope that, Ray involves us as you're moving forward to creating or choosing a system to make sure an auditor's eye is on that, to ask those questions. Is there separation of duty in that system? Is there ability to be deleted? Is there an audit step or process in that? That should all exist in a really good procurement system. So definitely, we're not expecting a corrective action plan that's just going to be trashed once a new system, but definitely that those recommendations are incorporated into a new system.
And I would just add to Ray Majors, one of the reasons this new structure had separated the program from operation is Ray. This is Ray's focus. Ray is focused on the operation of the agency. And I totally believe when you need to build an institution that when Mary and I move on, that the next people don't have to deal with these issues. And that's why I can't tell you how much I appreciate Ray and his ability. He had some of the issues before even this audit, and this just validates that the kind of thing he wants to do.
Thank you. Before we get to questions, I do like to go to the public first. And so Tessa, do we have any public comments on this particular item?
Thank you, Chair. There are no public comments.
Okay, great. Then I will open it up to the floor where I will undoubtedly find some curious minds from the board members. Who would like to go first, if anyone? Bob?
Yeah. First of all, I want to congratulate Mary and her team, and I want to congratulate Hassan as well. This particular topic, I don't care what company you go with, I don't care what agency you're with, this is always a big, big topic. With Sandag and the complexity that it has, you can expect that it's going to be huge. Will the media attach itself to this? Probably. Understanding, and I appreciate the comments regarding the board, Hassan. It's going to happen. But you guys as auditors over there, you stay out of that. This audit committee stays out of it. We're here to focus on this report. And so I just have a couple of questions, and then I'll pass it on to my other two colleagues. I'm going to assume that part 2 is also a performance audit.
Yes.
That is correct. Okay. So, and maybe this, I don't know, Mary, if this question should be directed to you or to Lloyd, but this is just understanding the invoices that you're looking at for part 2. And Lloyd, did you say, how many invoices did you say you're looking at?
We've identified within its open contract, within its audit period, over 10,000 invoices.
Okay. How did you determine those contracts as well as those invoices to look at? What was your methodology?
We
Let me just go over that real quick. So there's two processes within the second phase two, and you're probably familiar with this, Bob. When we typically find areas of concern and identify a specific contractor with areas of concern, which we did here, we found 10 of them, you can't say there's something wrong without quantifying how much that something is. So they will be reviewed 100%. Then we'll do a random selection and random sample of the other, just a small amount of other ones, so that we're able to, identify a consistent pattern, not just for what we found as these specific contractors, but in a general sense. So we won't look at all 10,000 of them, but as far as the contractors that we've identified potential concerns around, we will look at those 100% and then randomly select and sample others.
Will that sampler, does that sampling and those contracts, do those involve some of the ones that were on the graphs that you showed us?
All of the ones that were in the table will be 100% reviewed. And then we'll randomly select other contracts of the 1,000 something that we identified as a whole. We'll randomly select some of them as well, probably 10%.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you for those questions. Anybody else? Agnes?
First of all, I want to thank Mary and the team. Clearly, you have done a lot of work, a lot of information to unpack here for me, reading through the report. So thanks for your good work here. But I also want to thank Hassan and the management. I mean, it's really great to hear that. I definitely get a sense management wants to work together. I heard word like partnership, working together. I think that's really why we're here, right? We want to make Sandag a even better organization to serve San Diego. So I think that's the spirit I'm seeing here. So I'm really glad to see that. I do have a question for Mary, that for phase two, I assume, I understand, it would take some time to go through the detailed work. Will you be able to come back, you think, to give the audit committee a clear sense that if there are issues financially, like are the issues that will cause Sandag to lose revenue because it didn't comply with federal or state law? Would there be a conclusion, like are there expenses that we overpay and therefore can go back and recover them? So I assume that will be the outcome of phase two, right?
Yes.
It's really good to hear that, so far there's no intentional wrongdoing being discovered, but there may be some issue because of the internal controls issue, right? So I want to make sure that will be the outcome of part two.
Yeah, very good question, Agnes, and definitely. So that's why we're looking at 100% of those ones identified to make sure there is nothing going on, and then randomly selecting the others. But what we will, until our audit's complete, we won't give specifics in detail, of course. That would be compromising the audit as well as any potential investigations that may result from the audit. We will update you as we move forward on, are we finding areas and are they more around control weaknesses and just not adhering to the contract, or are they more concerning? So we would update that, but we would not provide specifics. When the part two does come out, there will be specifics in there. I will still withhold the names of the contractors because, like I said, it could be, one, we don't want to have a defamation of character on a business unless we really know what's going on. And two, it may be deferred out. So we would never put in an audit report the name of a contractor. We may identify the specifics around what we found, the dollar amount, and then we would continue to name it contractor A. Now, after the audit is completed and finalized and issued, people can request a PRA and they have entitlement to that information and who that contractor is, unless I've decided it needs to be an investigation or defer it out, then it still wouldn't be released. So it just is really depending, but the specific dollar amounts, the specific matters, totally, absolutely will be identified in part two.
Okay, good. Yeah, that'll be good to have that clarification. Is it just internal control issues, training, or there's some financial, real issues there?
Yes.
I also want to echo what Bob said. I'm sure the media will pick up the story and throwing rocks. And I want all of us to stay out of that, right? Because that's not what we're here for.
Comment, if I may. And you know, there is members of our own board who submitted, asked Mary for information, and were submitting public information requests. And you know, the public has the right to know, I think, everything with the table, you know. But sometimes the desire to catch the political world of being so much into getting information could be colliding with what she's trying to do exactly. And I wanna see exactly the answer to your question myself, and I'm sure my team wants to have the same, because the sooner we know about what's going on, if there is intentional wrongdoing, we'll deal with it. If there is something wrong, we'll deal with it. If it's a matter of policy, we'll deal with it. But I just want you to know that when some of our own board members, we get, you know, every week a request just because somebody is fishing, that costs a lot of money. A lot of public resources with a lot of people are put in that. We're obliged and we'll comply with that. But I just want to caution you that you talk about the media. It's the media generated by actually our own board.
And then one more thing to add is the intentional wrongdoing could be on the contractor side as a result of our lacking of controls or our weaknesses in training and poor planning and such like that. So it could be on our end, we're doing everything we can do with a lack of training or policy or whatever, where we can improve that. And as a result of not having that in place and being strong in those areas, we had a contractor that was intentionally taking advantage of that. So there is that possibility.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stuart, do you have any comments, questions?
Yeah, thanks. A couple of things. You know, first, in addition to just the overall work product, I really want to thank you, Mary and team, for breaking this into 2 audits because there is a lot here. But having said that, you know, this is immensely valuable stuff for the agency. And, you know, I think the chair said it well in our last agenda item in relation to the P-card audit, that it really shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that for an agency that has not previously undergone this type of auditing, that there will be weaknesses that have been found. And, you know, with regard to the comments Hassan made, which I totally have sympathy for, we should all be celebrating the fact that we're uncovering these weaknesses and that we've got people committed to making the changes necessary, as opposed to the, you know, turning it into a circus. So, you know, my colleagues have spoken to that, so I'll move on. The one thing with regard to work plan, you know, I hear you about not wanting to create a work plan that then has to get scrapped for a new ERP system, perhaps. But I think we all know that, you know, ERP system adoptions don't take place overnight. And so, you know, for everybody who's concerned about the weaknesses, as I'm sure everybody in this room and who's listening are, is there any sense of what the timetable is going to be on the ERP system?
Well, from speaking with Ray, they're in the process of actually moving through, and I believe they've selected an ERP system that has a contract and procurement module already. And so implementation of that, Ray has told me within a 2-year period. So, yeah.
Thanks for the question. And Mary, the information you have from Ray is similar to what I have. So yes, the ERP system has been selected. Implementation began earlier this year. There's a couple of phases to the implementation. I believe the first phase, which would include a lot of the contract management functionality, should be online by next summer. So about 8 or 9 months from now.
Okay, well, that's encouraging because, again, you know, those that we all know, those things sometimes can go on forever. And I would just defer to you guys as to whether there are pieces of what you've recommended here that actually could be adopted even as part of the process of implementing that ERP system. So it's literally not a, well, we really need to kind of wait a year to 2 years.
Absolutely, and Ray and I have discussed that, and there actually are. They've already implemented. One of the things we implemented together, and I'll quickly share this, was bringing Crystal to my office as an independent body from contracts. She comes from actually the port that has a lot of external insight of contracting around federal and state grants, but grant programs, but comes to, and then has the exposure from Sandag's contract and procurement, and now is under me as an independent body who will be doing full-time QC and continuous auditing around contracts. So this improvement around practices, training, all of this is already going on. In addition to, I believe Ray shared with me that they've established, and Hassan just, an independent project management team. So there's a lot of stuff already taking place to bring improvements, and that system will just help and add to that, and then update the policies and procedures around the system.
Great, okay. Then just one final, just informational point. With regard to the tables, which I thought had some fascinating information, for context, I was looking for, and I don't think it was in there, I'm not sure if anybody mentioned today, the total dollar value of contracts that were, you mentioned a number of times the total number of contracts, but does anybody have some perspective on the total dollar value represented?
I could get you that very shortly afterwards. I don't have it on me.
We have that information, and we can just email it to you and let you know the dollar amount. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Good questions. And yeah, I will add my thanks to the team, both the management team and the IPA's office for this very thorough report. And also just start off by saying my thoughts are definitely with Ray and his family. And I hope he's able to work through that. I understand what a challenging time that can be, and and understand that it's unfortunate that he couldn't be with us today. But it does lead into one question, which was, tailing on a little bit to what Stuart said, or Board Member Halpern said. One of the things I had expected Ray to be doing was, because as Mary, you alluded to, there's been conversations around actions that are already being taken, and the fact that we are actually going forward and doing a wholesale rework of this entire process. And the first thing I was going to do is it'd be good if Ray, perhaps even in the next meeting, could come back and describe what those actions are, because I was kind of expecting that today, but maybe in the next meeting he can come back and actually talk about what the things are that are being done, the items that are already being addressed. So it's not like people get the perception that we're just sitting and waiting for part two, because that's not what's going on. We do want to address these, and I think that would be very helpful in that particular arena. And then the other question I have for your team is, given the likely scope of the amount of change in our processes that we're going to do to address the findings that we've found, are you going to expect that we're going to be able to validate the new processes with just our continual auditing process, or are we going to have to do another more minor level audit? Because, having been in industry for a lot of years, I do know one thing, that when you build something, do a major change, you fix all the problems you know about, and you frequently create ones that you forgot about. So how are we going to catch those new things that come up, and as we're addressing all the ones that are known?
So that's where Crystal again comes in, as well as all of us, is moving on to the new fiscal year. We're moving into a continuous auditing process, which means P cards are going to have a continuous auditing, contracts and procurement will be continuous auditing. And in that new system comes about, it will be continuously audited. So we'll pick up on anything that's got a niche or is not working, and we'll identify it as we go.
Yeah, great, thanks. And then just to lead into some questions, so for example, and again, thank you, Michael and Crystal, great information. A couple of, when you're going through the findings, I heard one comment made several times when we were talking about risks, one risk was loss of federal funding as a possible risk. My understanding is that this agency has been through multiple federal audits with respect to federal grants before, or at least one.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to address that.
Okay, yeah.
So we need to, because we keep facing this, but we need to make it clear. When you have an external auditor looking at an organization, they have a much more narrow scope. They do a really high level sample of federal programs, and then they touch on things within that. they just couldn't possibly do the level of review that we do, which is why it's not that these external auditors, why haven't they found any of this stuff? They've been auditing this agency for years.
Yeah.
It's really that their scope is far more surface.
No, and you were making my point. So thank you for that, which is we are passing these audits and it's not like we aren't being observed at all. It's just another point that reinforces how much more diligence having an independent auditor will put on this organization and how much better it makes us. And again, it goes to show that there are likely lots of other organizations that have similar problems out there that are passing these federal audits, and it's just not exposed. So good for us for
Which is why
working on
there's
this.
such an importance for internal audit,
Right.
a well-staffed internal audit, because the internal auditors, in fact, the external auditors will tell you this, they rely on a strong internal audit team within the organization. I meet with them every time they start their audit. And it's their reliance because they can't possibly audit the way an internal auditor would. They just couldn't. They need to make a profit. They have a narrower scope. They're in it for that. An internal auditor is there just to do the nuts and bolts of it and bring some assurance to that external auditor.
Right.
And I just need to validate what Mary's saying to your question. We just went through a triennial FDA audit, and we did a big business with FDA, $1 billion for Midcoast. So their focus is something, but the fact that these federal agencies know that we have an internal auditor is actually will go toward more of us getting more funding. I mean, we're really successful in Washington and Sacramento, and we're going to be more successful. I would say the external audits don't get into the controls and policies. This deep audit says, okay, we need to control and policy. And once this is done right, these external audits should be even easier to make because you already went through some of these functions.
Yeah, thank you. Then I guess I'll fortunately note that I'm not an attorney and this is not a court, so I will ask a leading question, which is that I was kind of curious, given, we broke this up into two parts, and just with the uncertainty, and Michael, again, I'll just go back to something that you put in your comments, which was, we aren't, for finding 7, we aren't sure why we're seeing these patterns, right? We just have observed patterns. And unfortunately, as per other board members, and I wish I didn't have to say this, there are going to be people that take advantage of those patterns and put their own spin on it, which is not going to help this agency or this organization. But given that, I am curious why we included finding 7 as part of part 1 as opposed to part 2. And my assumption is there are real risks there that we want to start addressing now as opposed to waiting till late next year, but maybe there's other reasons too.
So we included 7 because it's a finding,
Right.
and the analytics supports the finding. The analytics we have found, we're not potentially finding, we actually found there's poor weaknesses in controls
Right.
around that process. There's poor planning.
Right.
There's a lack of training. There's a consistent use, high levels of on-calls, much greater percentages than the average base, which is 5% versus 493%. Those analytics and those weaknesses identified tells us there is a problem. We have to then go further into what we found in those tables to see if there's intentional wrongdoing on the contractor side as a result of those problems.
Yeah, but as an example, one of the results could be maybe our benches are too small, right? It could result in this kind of stuff, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so
Absolutely.
it's not like there's malicious intent, there's fraud necessarily at this point. It's just, this is a finding, and it's unfortunate that we have to put it out there at this point without the conclusion because people are going to draw their own conclusions. I just want to make sure people know there aren't conclusions yet. It's just a pattern we want to identify and start closing the loop, closing the things that can cause it to happen.
Well, there is a conclusion.
Yeah.
There's a conclusion that there's weaknesses in controls, a
Controls,
lack
yes,
of policy,
right.
and a lack of training. So that
Definitely.
is the conclusion.
Which is what we're going to start addressing now then.
Yes, that
Yeah.
table supports that. That
Right.
table shows there's something resulting from these areas of
Right.
weaknesses. And so us furthering to assure the public, to assure Sandag, to assure Hassan, is to look at what we found analytic-wise and assure that there's not abuse being taken on the contractor side as a result of those weaknesses.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
don't know, you look like you're going to say
was
something, but
going to say that even if 7 wasn't included, there is no guarantee that somebody not going to make a spin. I mean, you could take any
Oh,
sentence
yeah, no, I
there and,
understand
you
that.
know, it's-
I understand that. And yeah, and so,
this is election season, remember?
yes, it is. It is election season. And along those lines, I mean, I do think it's worth pointing out that,
Absolutely.
you know, we've talked about it and we all believe, and I can personally attest to that the statement Mary pounds into me on a regular basis is transparency is paramount, right? We want to be transparent. And so this whole concept of not currently acknowledging or reacting to the PRA request is not because we don't want to be transparent, it's because we want to do a good job. And it's important for us to be able to complete our investigation before somebody else comes in and starts messing with it. And so just to get back to that comment on the PRA request. So once again, yeah, thanks to the teams. That's the questions I have. Or any other comments or questions in the interim? And I believe this is the request here to have an action to forward this to the board. Is that what we're looking for?
Accept the report.
in
November 18th, right?
November 18th.
November 18th, so,
We have it scheduled to go to the board on November 18th.
right, okay. So I'd entertain a motion to accept and forward and approve sending this to the board.
I would so motion.
Board Member Monson and second by Board Member Wong Nickerson. Can we call the vote, please? Oh, shoot, I keep forgetting. Yes. One for yes. Oh, is the voting screen's not even up yet?
Still in the virtual world.
Oh, it is behind me. Okay. That motion passes unanimously with the members present. Thank you again. Thank you, Hassan. We will now move on to item number 7, which is the Office of the Independent Auditor First Quarter Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Report. Mary.
This will be really quick. We have no changes from the, the last report that we issued, but I did commit to the audit committee that I would provide these reports on a quarterly basis. So the good news is we haven't had any additional fraud, waste, and abuse reporting. And the even better news is that am getting ready to close one more, have closed 3 that will come up as closed on the next quarter report. It didn't hit the deadline here. One is partially substantiated, 2 are unfounded. So that's great news. And so that will come to you next quarter. That's all.
Okay, great. Thank you. So whoops, Tessa, do we have any? I'll look and see. Well, do we have any board member comments or questions first? Stuart.
Thanks. Just one. Can you refresh our memories as to where you are or may not be in the process of actually recruiting a full-time fraud waste investigator, or is that going to continue to be your part-time job?
That's me. That's me. We don't have a position for that. I can chat with Hassan. I know he's been very supportive of getting staff. I do have Doug that I'm training on investigations, so he has started helping me with some investigations. But I would love to have actually a CFE. I think that's important. I'm a CFE, but I think it's important to have a full-time CFE doing these full-time. So hopefully in the new fiscal year, I can talk with Hassan and we can get a position, or maybe Andre wants to give us one now. On the spot there, Andre.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Board Member Monson.
I'm going to kind of dovetail on what Stuart, because I'm looking at this and I really appreciate the work, Mary, that you've been putting into this. Thank God you haven't gotten any more, because my concern is, I mean, you did finish 3, but a lot of times these reports are somewhat time sensitive. And that's why I really encourage either train a staff member or bring someone on new that can kind of help with getting these investigations taken in a little bit more timely fashion. And that's no negative on you, Mary.
Right.
Because I know you've got a lot of hats you're wearing right now. So that's all I wanted to comment on.
I'll work on that. I'm Looking at him right now, I'm telling him, you hear it? Everyone needs it. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Tessa, do we have any public member comments on this agenda item?
There are no public comments on this item.
Thank you, Tessa. Okay, back to any other board member comments? Otherwise, this one was just an information item. So then we will move on to the audit committee discussion on proposed amendments to Sandag Board Policy 39. I guess I'll take this one unless you would prefer to kick it off. Mary?
You can kick it off if
Okay.
you want notes. Do you have notes?
I think I have the notes in front of
Okay.
me. I'll do my best with it. Just so everyone knows, this is something that was brought up before my term on the committee, and was taken to the full board close to early my term. And at that point in time, some of the recommendations that we had made weren't adopted, but the general context of what some discussions that have occurred, and particularly between myself and Stuart, and we involve Mary as well, that we're learning from that these fit into are just two areas, one of which is institutional knowledge and committee continuity, and what can we do to ensure that. As an example, hopefully this won't happen, but it's entirely possible that that myself, Mayor Vasquez, Stuart, and Bob could all disappear at very close to the same time, which I think would potentially be not a good thing for the organization to have, to try to avoid having that amount of turnover, because I can personally attest to, even after being on the board for 4 years, that it does take a long time to come up to speed and to be a contributing member in a committee like this. And so we want to make sure we have institutional knowledge. And the other area that's sort of addressed by some of the thoughts that we had is just making sure we're advocating for independence, and not having too close of a ties, so that we do maintain our public trust and that kind of stuff. So there are 4 areas listed in the staff report. One, and then one more that we talked about when we met, and just to list those out, was just the selection process for the public members was one area. The term limits and how they're appointed was another area, or how they're managed is another area. The appointment of the chair and the vice chair. The addition of a public member to serve as an alternate, potentially, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, were the 4 that was in the staff report. And then one other thing that we mentioned, or that we talked about, was just having potentially an attendance policy. The other committees in Sandag actually have an attendance policy. Because of the way this one formed, we didn't. So we may want to consider talking about that as well. I'll just being transparent, I'll go through some thoughts that we came up with, and we'll solicit some feedback, take any public comment that might have. A couple ways to work this. I think Mary, for reasons that we can talk about, is looking for some action and trying to move this forward. I think it might be a good idea to take input today, get some ability to socialize these thoughts, and then come back at the next meeting, whatever that is, and take action at that point. But that's another area that we should discuss as a committee. So moving into these 4 particular areas, the public membership selection process. Again, this gets into just the independence and public appearance of how the committee is operated. Right now, I believe the board policy states that the chair picks a member of the board, and then it can be a member of what the policy states is it can be a financial director or the CFO of a member agency. Although I will note that in the last go around that we had, it ended up actually being the CFO of Sandag, which I don't even know if that's technically supposed to be allowed, but it ended up happening. So we should be explicit about that too, just so. And then a third party member that's recruited by the agency. And that's what exists today. What we talked about is possible modifications is that it would still be a board member that would be part of the process. Well, we sort of splitting up into two, possibly 3 phases here. There is a screening process and a selection process. We thought as far as a screening process goes, there should be an identified screening process in which both the Sandag CFO and the Sandag IPA would take part in, and they would agree or not, agree that these candidates are qualified. They are actually qualified to be part of the selection process. And then from that, we could move on to a selection process, which would involve a board member of Sandag, a public member of the audit committee, and a member agency finance person, not the Sandag CFO. And they would screen, or they would then select the member. One interesting idea that was put out there by Stuart, give him credit for this, because I do kind of like it, is that selection committee could actually be requested to select multiple candidates that they liked, up to 2 or 3 that could be interviewed, and then it would be a random drawing as to who actually received the committee appointment, again, just to eliminate and remove all appearances of any favoritism that might be happening there. So why don't we talk about this one for a little bit, and then I'll move on to the next one if anyone has any comments or questions. And actually, I guess I'll start with Tessa. Do we have any public member comments on this item?
There are no public comments.
Okay, so Mary, I'll let it go to you first on this particular item in case you want to say something before.
Thanks, Chair.
Yeah.
We had this discussion, and I really like the idea of what was just shared with the selection process or the screening process being me and Andre, the chair of the audit committee, and a public member of the audit committee. That gives the insight from Andre's perspective and the environment of Sandag and understanding that environment, and also my perspective or the IPA's perspective of understanding our environment. We have a screening of potential candidates that actually would qualify for the position, and then move forward and kind of hand it over to strictly a board member, a public member of the audit committee, and an agency finance person. That keeps it completely independent and unbiased on Andre's side and on my side. But I definitely believe that it should not involve management of any person from management of Sandag actually selecting the individual.
Bob.
Okay, so let me make sure I've got the process right. So basically, the first step would be a screening system. It's going to include Andre as well as Mary. Okay, you're going to screen the candidates and determine who's moving on to the next step, which would include a group of non-management people from Sandag, a finance person most likely.
Not from Sandag, from a member agency.
Oh, a member agency. Okay. So, excuse me. And who else would be included in that?
And the audit committee chair, or a board member, and a public member from the audit committee. Okay. So a board member, public member, and a non-Sandag finance person from a member agency.
And what's being proposed as a third step would be simply a random draw, which I will tell you, I kind of like that idea. I really do, because that takes out everything. The only question I have is, and I think it's a simple answer, what's the point of having that second?
Well, because what that does is actually there's one little step in between is an interviewing process. So once we do a screening of here's who qualifies to even be considered, then these individuals on the selection committee would say, interview these individuals. And then from there, they would select that last and final pile that would go into, and a hand grab would be out.
Yeah, we could be so lucky, but you may have 10 to 20 people that pass the screening process, right? But you don't want to interview, so you would select that down to 3 to interview maybe. Right. And then if all 3 pass the interview, you could just do a random drawing, that kind of stuff.
Right. So the only job Andre and I would really have is these individuals qualify to even be seating on the audit committee.
Other comments otherwise? Okay. So instance of time. So the other item was public member term limits and staggering of member terms. Currently, we have in the policy 2-year terms. They're all appointed at the same time and with a maximum service of 5 years. And of course, as we've just talked about, that in our minds presents a possibility of just too much turnover and too much loss of institutional knowledge. So I'll talk about 2 and 4 at the same time then. So 2 things that we talked about to manage through that were, 1, instead of having a 2-year term with a 5-year limit, that we would have 3-year terms with a 6-year limit, and that 2 people, they would be staggered. You have 2 appointed at one point and 1 appointed at another point. So that would give a little bit longer term, because I think at least the public members can either educate me or correct me, is that it can take a while to come up to speed. And so when you're on a 2-year term, if you've gone through the first year and finally feel like you got your footing, you only have a year left potentially at that point to be productive. So we like the concept of doing a 3-year term, gives you another year to be productive, and then also staggering it a bit. The other thing that I had thought of is, I do know that we have an alternate that's a board member on the committee, is also the concept, again, for institutional knowledge, to establish an alternate position for a public member that would be preferentially filled by a prior voting public member of the committee. So basically, for instance, if Stuart leaves, or if Bob leaves, or Agnes leaves, because they're termed out after 6 years, they could at that point serve as an alternate, just to help bring other people up to speed as well, because we do appreciate the institutional knowledge, and it can be helpful. And then the last instance, which, looking for feedback on this one too, is right now it's 5 years you're out. We're talking about 6 years would be maximum service, but that would be a continuous service. So if you took a 3-year break, someone could come back again after 1 full term, and as opposed to, and I think that should also cover serving as an alternate as well. You'd actually have to be off the committee for 3 years, and then you could come back again and serve again if that was the case in that. So those were the types of changes that we had discussed, and curious, again, once again, Mary, feel free to add any clarification.
No, I like the longer terms, because I agree, it's not easy to get up on the environment again, and just get into the flow of things. So 2 years is definitely too short of a time. 3 years is appealing. That would give someone a commitment of total 6 years. I don't think 8 years would be appealing to some people, couldn't really commit or know to commit that long. So I think 3 years is really good.
Okay. Any comments, questions? Stuart?
I'm curious, I'm on the City of San Diego Audit Committee. I know their structure is a 4 and 4. I'm curious, Bob, from the port, if you can recall, and Agnes, I think you're on the Airport Authority Audit Committee, if you happen to know what their term structure might be for public members.
They've actually, the port has just changed their structure since I was there. When I was there, it was, I believe, 3 years with a max of 6. And that's why I agree with this structure.
Yeah, I think an airport says 3 years. And I can attest to it as a new member, the newest. It really took me a while to figure it out. I mean, I have a finance and audit background, but just to understand what the organization does, it took some time. So I would think 3 years makes a lot more sense. Yeah.
Okay, great. The next one was what's shown as item number 3, which is appointment of the chair and the vice chair. Currently, the policy states that the chair of the Sandag board will appoint the chair and the vice chair from the committee members at their discretion. The thought process is that maybe we would like to show a little bit more independence. I'll describe all options that are considered, and the reason I'm being a little bit tongue-tied here is you'll notice there's a little not alignment here around the necessarily approach, but so it's open for discussion. Mary can argue, and I'll let her for what she was hoping for, which was that the chair of the committee must be a public member. That is what she would like to put forward. I think Stuart came up with a possible alternative, which was that the committee itself just vote. So the 5 voting members of the committee get to decide who's chair and vice chair and vote on it, which is a pretty common approach in a lot of the other committees I sit on. And I will throw out a twist on that possibly as well, just for consideration, that I came up with last night. So this is going to be a total surprise on these two, which is just that we could say that the IPA and the chair of the board meet and confer, and if they can agree to the chair and vice chair, that's what it will be. If they can't, then the committee votes and actually votes on who's chair and vice chair. So that's just another possible option as well. But once again, I'll let Mary, because I know she's passionate about this one, say a few things.
I'm going to try to behave. So thanks, Chair. So I kind of would be okay with that if I knew that the IPAs in the future will be me and the chairs in the future will be some chairs and not other chairs. So that concerns me because you just don't know who's sitting in those seats. Because I actually did have some input on selecting you. I was totally in favor of that. And so I will just say that my passion about this has nothing to do with Chair Zito, because I haven't experienced any impairment of my independence. But I have experienced impairment of independence in the past situations here at Sandag. And because of that, to me, it's so important that we assure that, we have someone in board leadership who already carries a lot of power as a board leadership, selecting the chair of the audit committee. You can see, depending on who's sitting in that role, that there could be a potential for impairment and interference. And I do not take well to either one of those. And so depending on who the IPA is, some IPAs might be able to be swayed while others may not. Again, I would like to see policies put in place so that no IPA is in that situation. So for me, yes, it is a preference that only a public member be a chair of the audit committee. That would ensure non-bias. And then the vice can be a board member. But with that being said, I know that that's probably not going to be something that anyone is okay giving up that kind of power and selection. So I would say that I would be completely supportive of the other option, which is what other audit committees that I've been on has done, which is allow the audit committee to make the decision and vote for the chair and the vice chair each year. So I would be okay with that.
Okay, thank you. Comments or questions on that one?
Having been in Mary's position in the past with the board, independence of the auditor is ultimately important. Independence of the audit committee is important. I'm tending to lean towards, well, originally I was leaning towards Mary's suggestion that it need to be someone from the public. But as more I thought about the suggestion I think Stuart had come up with, I'm beginning to like that a little bit better, that the audit committee vote the chair and the vice chair. I like Chair Zito, I like your idea, but again, I think Mary's right. Again, depending on who the board chair is, it could be pretty tough for Mary. Can pretty much handle herself. You all had noticed that already. But who's to say when she leaves and the new one comes in? So that's why I'm kind of leaning towards, I think it should be the audit committee that votes in the chair and the vice chair.
Okay, any other comments people wish to make? Agnes?
Yeah, I also like the idea to have the audit committee members to vote, because we don't know who's going to be the public member. Would that person know enough to be the chair in any given year? I mean, I'll be very comfortable, Stuart or Bob to be the chair, but I also don't know in the future who those other members would be. I also think that is, I agree totally, this needs to be a very independent body. And the chair of the audit committee do have a lot of influence on, what get put on agenda item and things like that. So I do think, trust the audit committee members and pick the best person as the chair. So that's my take.
Okay, thanks for the feedback. Just making sure I'm driving towards my deadline here. I'm going to, for now, skip the attendance one, just because I think that we can take that up later and just talk about where we're at right now, which is, again, we can either take action on this, formalize all of these and vote to move them on as recommendations to the board. I suspect, and actually this is not something I confirmed with Mary, I suspect one of the concerns or desires to do that is just if it's not done now, or I said, if it is done now, perhaps, and I'm going to say perhaps, these policies could take effect for next year, because I think there might be some concern of what's going to happen next year, because my term as chair is up at the end of the year, but also understanding that the board agendas are controlled by the board chair. If they choose not to put this on the agenda, it won't happen before next year. So there's that mitigation. On the flip side of it, as I pointed out, when we did this last time, it didn't go very well, and I will take a good part of the blame for that, just being a newbie and a new chair. And, so personally, if it was my preference, I would like to, I haven't run any of these by staff, much less any other board members, and I'd like to have the time to do that, and then perhaps come back and give an update on what I heard, and then we could finalize and send it to the board. But that will be guaranteed at that point to be too late to make it for next year. The only mitigation I can offer to Mary is that, I promise I'll sign. I'm not running for term this year, and I think she's been okay with my term on the chair. So I promise I'll re-up my name. And then if you guys have been happy with me, you can all go and campaign to put me back as chair, and then maybe that'll help mitigate that. But I'll open it up for the group discussion to say, do we want to try to take an action on this in the next 4 minutes? Or should we let me try to go socialize this a little bit and see if I can gain some support and hopefully get some better probability of these things passing?
And one quick thing, Chair Zito, it actually has to go to the executive committee first,
Right.
And then to the board. Yeah.
Correct.
If I could throw out a perspective, I have great sympathy for what you're describing, which is and I like your term socialization, because it's always better to, have those kinds of conversations, right? As opposed to if we take action and some people feel like, it's like take it or leave it, et cetera. But let me just as a question on that, because I also have great sympathy for the point Mary raises, which is if this gets pushed out, we don't have certainty as to who the leadership is, either this committee or the board, and that creates a certain degree of risk. What do you think about the notion that if we took action today and then you still tried to do a certain socialization, and if you found that there were problems, you came back, and I don't know, pursuant to Brown Act, whether you could email us or whatever, and say, look, what, there's some real problems. I think we need more time on this. So in other words, I'm looking for, is there a hybrid opportunity here?
To answer that question, I don't know in the context of any objectives that we might have with respect to near-term timeframes. I don't expect to make much progress on, I certainly can socialize with staff, because part of my concern is staff, John, or even Amber Lynn may come up and say, are you nuts? And, or something like that, because I haven't done any of that yet. I don't really anticipate getting anybody's mind share till after Election Day. Honestly, I really don't, at least with respect to board leadership. It's just not going to happen. So then that just turns into, if you go to Mary's point, it's got to go to executive. It's got to go from executive to the board. And then I don't really know who's going to be in control of what agendas when at that point.
Well, then if I could, let me throw out just to the group, if we think that this is important enough that we would want to then consider scheduling a special meeting to accommodate the opportunity for the socialization. The fact that the currently scheduled or recently canceled November meeting was problematic. But we would certainly have, Emberlyn, tell me if I'm wrong, the potential to schedule a special meeting if we felt that there was something important enough to do that to facilitate getting this done before year end potentially, right? Or no?
Well, under the Brown Act, we do have the ability to set special meetings outside of the committee's ordinary meeting schedule. However, I will not comment on the ability to coordinate that right now, just given the limited number of Fridays that are available in the month of November.
Or other days of the week?
It would have to be December. It's not going to be November.
I have a recommendation. We take action today and we move it to the executive committee. And at that point, can't the executive committee, Amberlynn, make some adjustments or recommendations before it goes to the board?
Any changes to board policy are presented to the executive committee in red line format. So they would need to see the precise changes to board policy 39 that the committee would be suggesting.
So I would be happy to make those red line and have that ready to go to the executive committee. And we could probably do that in November towards the end. Is there a November 18th meeting?
I believe there is at this time. However, it would need to have the recommendation of the audit committee.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge.
In order to move it to the
That's
executive
leading
committee.
back to my point, which is what we probably should have as a red line version of the policy come back here first. And so that would then request a special meeting to do that at that point.
We couldn't take action on each one of these and then I update the board policy and then have a subcommittee that looks at those and then we move it?
I don't know.
A subcommittee would still need to report back to the full body in order to get a recommendation. The subcommittee cannot take action on behalf of the full body. No, they cannot, unfortunately. It is a Brown Act committee, so unfortunately, all deliberations and votes need to occur in public.
Just sort of pushing all the potential alternatives, and I know you have to go.
Yeah, I'm going to disappear real soon.
Would it be permissible that hypothetically, the board took action on these in concept and delegated to a subcommittee the working out the language with Mary so that it didn't then have to come back for a subsequent meeting?
Again, it's the executive committee that reviews board policy amendments and then
No,
makes a
sorry, I meant
recommendation
just,
to the board.
I thought you were raising the point that the audit committee wouldn't have the opportunity to review the language if we simply voted today. And I was asking that if we voted on the concepts and then delegated to an ad hoc subcommittee to work with Mary on the language so that the language wouldn't have to come back to the full committee, would that potentially be permissible?
No, because the committee does need to make a recommendation by vote that they are making a formal recommendation to the
sorry to
executive
interrupt. At
committee
this
on the
point, I'm
language.
feeling like we're trying to twist something into something that may not need to be twisted into. So if it really is this important, I would recommend that we try to schedule a special meeting in December and do that. I mean, I do think that once again, as we mentioned, there is a chance for turmoil next year, but I do think that if this committee is wholly aligned and supportive of my chairmanship, there's a really good chance I can be back again next year and we can continue along with this if it doesn't work out. But and I promise to advocate. I will still be on the board as an alternate, even if I weren't on this committee. I'm promised to advocate for it, but I would suggest that we do what I had suggested at this point, because I do need to take off and I'll socialize. If we can try to find a December meeting. If we can't make that happen, then I will just do my best to advocate on our behalf, because I would like to, I don't want the board to look at this if this was rushed. And if we don't have the policy in front of us, it sounds like they could view it as not having had its full vetting. That's all. Does that make sense?
No comment.
Yeah, I know. Okay. Well, I mean, again, it's up to somebody on here if they want to make a motion, but I'm going to disappear in 2 minutes or 1 minute, or otherwise that'll be our action or no action.
So if I understand what we're all talking about here, I'm going to make a motion that we try and come up with a special meeting in December.
Okay.
To go over the policy changes and then hopefully get it to the board as quickly as we can.
Okay.
I'll second that.
Okay, we'll do our best. Can we call for the vote? It doesn't show up. Oh, there it goes, finally. That motion passed unanimously. Thanks for the consideration. Apologies, I need to take off. The next audit committee is scheduled for November 4th. I believe there's consideration that may be canceled. So keep your eyes out for that. And with that, we are adjourned. Everybody have a good weekend. Stay dry and go Padres. You too, sir. Well, again, it's been a few while. Thanks for your help on trying to.
So look at a Friday, so that works best for you guys, and we'll just throw it out there. Yeah. Well, yeah, we never had it.
Yes, right. November schedule.